Beginning of the idea of secularism and modern science representing the truth, and religion representing tradition and superstition, and so on. And so that gives the foundation for, once you accept that definition, for the disappearance of religion. The more science you know, the less religion you will know, and eventually you won't have any religion at all. But what we have now is a re-emergence of the idea that religion and secularity interact and by definition need each other to be analytically understood. At least that's what Talal says. And I really find it very persuasive. Another social scientist who is one of these people who, Saba Mahmoud, is someone who is a very good social scientist, and people don't think of her necessarily as an imam kind of figure. People don't think of her as stating Islamic doctrine. They think of her as being a social science analyst, like Talal. Secularism is not simply the doctrinal separation of church and state, but the re-articulation of religion in a manner that is commensurate with modern sensibilities and modes of government. To rethink the religious is also to rethink the secular and its truth claims. We not only have to ask, is the religious worldview true? But we have to ask, is the secular worldview true? That we need an interactive definition if we are going to think about modes of government, whether we're talking about modes of government in Europe or whether we're talking about modes of government in Muslim majority countries or wherever. Now, I will say, I like to make sure when I give you a quote, one of the things with a PowerPoint, when I give somebody a quote, I like to make sure that you have a face with the quote. Too often you get, or when you're reading an academic article or something, you read it and you're reading something. You are reading something. You are not reading someone. And, you know, somebody like Talal is a great person to have a cup of coffee with. And you need to hear his voice. So I like to have a picture of who is saying it, so that you have a visual, so that you are reminded that this isn't just some word that comes out of some Google computer. It's a word that comes out of the mouth and the fingers of a human being who is in these cases, who are believers as well as analysts. And the bottom line is that everybody, I don't care what you believe, but everybody is both a believer and an analyst. And so that we're looking then, and I'm breaking, I usually obey my wife. My wife is an economist and does a lot of government consulting. And she hates PowerPoint. And she especially hates PowerPoint slides that have more than 3 lines in them. She says, then your audience just simply sits and reads and maybe copies, alhamdulillah, and so on. And usually I obey my wife, but on this case, because these are complicated things that we're dealing with, and I want you to see the words that I'm saying. Not just the people, but I want you to see the words that I'm saying. These are crucial definitional problems for understanding the real problems of survival of society, of a civil society in the 21st century. And so we have then, as we're looking at rethinking of secular and religion as done by major Islamic intellectuals. I won't give you a quote from Osama bin Laden. You can get enough of those. And most of those are no tape recorders. Yeah, probably. Oh, yes, there is a tape recorder, which isn't going. I forgot to turn it on. Oh well. Osama bin, you don't need to know what Osama bin, for this discussion, you don't need to know what Osama bin Laden is saying. A spoiled Saudi brat with extra billions of dollars can say anything he wants to, and used to. An Egyptian medical doctor by the name of Zawahiri, sitting off in the mountains someplace, can say anything he wants to, but he doesn't have any Islamic credentials, and so on. And we can talk about them. There are some militant Islamic intellectuals that are worth reading, but I want us to catch the flavor of the alternative. Yes.
Yes. Could the general Sisi in Egypt not just say?
Just a second. I flew in and I got, so my ears are a little plugged, but yeah.
Could General Sisi in Egypt not just say, according to your definition of new secularism, that he is acting on behalf of the state to guarantee religion stays in its proper place in Egypt, which is becoming theocracy? Now, I don't believe for a minute that's what he's doing. He's doing something very different. But the definition would seem to lead to it.
The definition, he would have to, he makes the argument not in the legal terms, but in the security terms. And part of the difficulty with a military authoritarian ideological framework is that he is not a Nasser. Nasser provided an intellectual ideological alternative. Sisi is providing a security ideological alternative. A Sisi, he may be right, he may be wrong, but a Sisi is providing an alternative that says, I don't care what these guys believe, I think they are a security threat. And this you can really see it now as he's beginning to jail the 6th of April anti-Muslim Brotherhood liberals as well as the Brotherhood. And so that for Sisi would have to shift from a security rhetorical mode to a theological rhetorical mode, and he's wise not to, I think, because if he does, he loses the intellectual battle. Any other sort of comments? Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you for...
Boom it out so they can hear.
Okay, so in the beginning, you described how the research in the modern time of secularity versus religion. And now you explain why it's not the correct framework, or you ask us to find another one. But I still didn't really understand what is the framework now, because you said that it's different kind of secularism, and I didn't really understand what you mean.
The framework now, quite frankly, is not a framework. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but the framework now, it's great if you're starting to define a master's thesis topic or a dissertation. That is, this is a time when people are making their own definitions. And the methodology at this point, the framework for analysis at this point, starts with the negative, which is secularization theory is wrong and so on. But the alternative then has to be, say what Talal is arguing for, is an ideology of non-ideology. And in terms of my own kind of thinking and work, and it relates to what Talal talks about, is the importance of discourse. That if you take the kind of arguments that Talal gives and Look at them in his Toward an Anthropology of Islam, or his book called Genealogies of Religion. He is arguing that religions are traditions of discourse. They are modes of presenting symbolic explanations of the nature of the universe and how humans should interact and so on. And so that you have then a recognition of the constant change, but the constant continuity as well. That religious traditions provide a vocabulary for expressions of positions in any kind of society, in any kind of context. And so that you end up then, in more practical terms, looking at, I'll put a couple of things up here. In nowadays, one of the most popular modes of analyzing things like the secularists versus the Islamists and so on is to fit within the analytical framework of social movement theory. Probably the clearest writer in social movement theory now is somebody by the name of Sidney Tarrow. And in social movement theory, the question is asked, why do people follow particular leaders? Why do people follow and join particular movements and so on? And one of the important areas that utilizes religious discourse is in the way that movements frame their ideology, the way that they frame their goals, the way that they frame their expectations. And so that in this sort of thing, what I'm talking about in a way is to analyze secularism and religion in the 21st century within the analytical framework of social movement theory, looking particularly at the discourse that shapes the way the movements frame their message and their organization. Is that?
It was great if you can say once again really slowly so I can write that.
Hey, is somebody taping this? No, well, it's basically now we look at how people mobilize movements. And the methodology then is to look not at specific institutional types, churches or secular movements, but look at social movements as a generic category. And then the first question is, why do people join social movements? And how do you mobilize people? I like to think my first real research was done on a Sufi brotherhood in the Sudan. I did my dissertation on the Sufi brotherhood in the Sudan and how it was became a political organization. But one of the interesting things about the Sudan, from the 1940s until the present, is the lesson that it gives us in terms of the importance of discourse and framing if you are going to shape the way people think and the way people act in the public square. When I first went to the Sudan in 1960, the Sudan had the strongest and best organized communist party in Africa. And it had a small, not nearly as well organized, Muslim Brotherhood. But by the 1980s, the Sudanese Communist Party had basically disappeared. Even in fair, popular elections, they lost. And the Brotherhood won. What's the difference? Well, the average Sudanese can understand a political program that is articulated in terms of Islamic norms and values, social justice, adl, and so on. But saying the same thing, but using a Marxist vocabulary of class warfare, didn't turn anybody in the Sudan on other than a few university intellectuals. And so that the way one framed the program of social justice, if one could look at it, and how do you mobilize people, how do you get them to join a movement? You have to persuade them, and how do you persuade them? You persuade them by starting where they are so that they can understand you and you bring them in. And so that would be then secularism is one of those interesting things of changing so that people still talk about the necessity of secular democracy. But when they talk about secular democracy in 2015, they aren't talking about the same thing that they were talking about 50 years ago. It's the recognition of the recognition of religious moral values as a part of a political program. Yeah?
Isn't this just populism?
Boom it out. Remember, my ears are plugged from the airplane.
Isn't this just populism, what you're talking about?
Big pardon? No, start.
Isn't this just populism, what you're talking about?
Sounds good.
Yeah?
Well, if populism means what gets the most people to support what your program is. This is why the Cairo University intellectuals could get Cairo University intellectuals to vote for them, and the Muslim Brotherhood got everybody else to vote for them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In the context of what Prof said, religion has been existing much before secularism.
Big pardon?
Religion has been existing much before secularism.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, how secularism can be the other of the religious order?
Okay.
Okay, and in other words, how religion and secularism can form a religious relation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the question, since religion has existed forever, how can somebody say that religion is defined by secularism, which has not existed forever? And the answer, my analytical answer is, it depends upon what you mean by religion. Religion, as used by most analysts today, is a term that refers to a phenomenon that did not exist before 18th century European Enlightenment thought. That religion, as used by most analysts today, as a term, makes sense